Joe Biden visiting Florida today for the first time as the Democratic presidential nominee. His goal, win over as many Latino voters as he can. And some good news for the former VP. A Monmouth poll out today shows that he is up by 26 points among Florida's Latino voters. Biden saying he will work like the devil to make sure that he turns every Latino and Hispanic vote. Tonight, he will host a Hispanic Heritage Month kickoff event in Florida. NBC News correspondent Mike Memoli joins me now. All right, Mike, let's talk about Biden's standings with Latinos in Florida and compare them back with Hillary Clinton's in 2016. She had a 27-point lead with Latinos, according to the exit polls in Florida 4 years ago, and she still lost the state. How does that compare to Joe Biden right now, and how does the Biden campaign attempt to narrow the gap with President Trump, keep Florida in play? I know we have that new poll out today, but prior to that, it looked like Joe Biden was trailing President Trump there in Florida.
Yeah, Allison, I mean, in this campaign, in a pandemic, and when you're running against Donald Trump, where there really is no playbook in even a normal circumstance, you can't take anything for granted. And the Biden team has really sort of had to start from scratch and sort of developing its playbook for Florida. And what we're seeing in Florida is really a microcosm for its strategy across the country. You have your big picture message. What have we heard from day one from the former vice president? This is a battle for the soul of America. But they got to narrow cast that message for different groups in different parts of the state, just like they're doing in different parts of the country. Now, as it relates to Latino voters, what that means is there are different communities of the Hispanic vote just throughout the state of Florida. You have especially Cuban Americans in South Florida, Miami, as well as Venezuelans. And then where the former vice president is going to be today in the Orlando area, you have a lot of Puerto Rican voters, a lot who were displaced by Hurricane Maria. And so the Biden campaign is running different advertisements just in those different markets. You have a Cuban dialect in South Florida. You have more of a Puerto Rican dialect in Central Florida. But Allison, there's really an acknowledgement on the part of the Biden campaign that there is ground to make up, especially among Latino voters. You heard Biden say that himself yesterday. And so that's why, as they look at the big picture strategy for the state, especially when there are polls showing different things with the Hispanic vote in Florida, they really are trying to press their advantage among other communities as well. There's been a surprising strength for the Biden campaign among senior voters. They're getting their own tailored advertising with testimonial-style ads featuring residents of the Villages, a very typically Republican-leaning town, but one where the pandemic has hit especially hard. In those advertisements, you're seeing seniors talk about how they haven't been able to see their families because of the pandemic. And then you have what the former vice president's doing today as well in Tampa. He just held a roundtable with some veterans. Florida has the third biggest veterans population in the country. It's a significant voting bloc as well. And his message there was focused very much on what we heard in terms of the comments that were reportedly made by the president in the Atlantic, attacking veterans, those who served in the military, questioning whether they were suckers or losers. Biden, as we heard him recently as well, pushing back very strongly. So this is all about upping your margins in the areas where you're strong, trying to boost the turnout, but also trying to win over voters where you can. And it's a mix of all of that that's playing into their strategy in Florida, Allison.
Mike, let me ask you about some of the impacts of the pandemic. Biden's campaign staff's grown 500% nationally since May, but COVID has really upended that traditional get out the vote effort that campaigns rely on. So how is the Biden campaign reaching out to voters given the new circumstances, and especially the Latino vote, which we just talked about, is so important here?
Yeah, I think one of the biggest contrasts we've seen between the Trump campaign and the Biden campaign has nothing to do with their message. It has to do with how they're trying to reach voters during a pandemic. The Republican National Committee, the Trump campaign, really focused on the fact that they are knocking on doors all across the country in these battleground states. The Biden campaign not doing that, but Biden's campaign manager, Jen O'Malley Dillon, just again defended that today, saying there's really no value in knocking on doors if people aren't answering them, which we're seeing in this pandemic. A lot of people unwilling to come to the door to take interact with folks, especially if they're not wearing masks. And so what the Biden campaign has been focused on is what they call relational organizing. Their biggest metric is not how many doors you knock on, but how many quality conversations that their team is having. Now, they've upped their staffing significantly since May 1st, 500% increase in the staff that's working on this. And they are doing some of that in person, not necessarily knocking on doors, but holding sort of community gatherings where feasible, where safe to do so. much more of that focus is on digital organizing, using a lot of the information. You'll remember from the Democratic convention, how often did you hear text vote, text this, text that to 30330? That was about building their list, being able to identify more voters so that they can use their new strength in terms of manpower to text them, to call them. Those kind of conversations, they say, have been really important in winning over the vote. And as it relates to the Latino vote, what they found is WhatsApp is a very important communication tool among the Latino community, and that's where a lot of their efforts are going as well, to have those conversations using the WhatsApp tool as well, Allison.
Mike, let's talk about the Trump campaign. They're trying to paint Joe Biden as a socialist. Could you explain to our viewers what's going on here and how the Biden campaign is countering that attack?
Yeah, I mean, I think folks have heard the Trump campaign and Trump surrogates talking about Biden as a socialist, and they simply chalk that up to the leftward bent of the Democratic Party lately that they're trying to portray, with Bernie Sanders, who a lot of folks, it's hard to remember all the way back in January, February, but he was leading in some of the polls nationally for a brief window. He also won at least 2 out of the first 3 contests. Iowa, of course, was a little bit of a confusing picture, but he very well was near the top there. And that led a lot of folks, especially on the Republican side, to say Democrats are now becoming socialists. That kind of phrasing, that term, has special significance in South Florida because of the refugee community, the community of Cuban Americans who left Cuba, who left a socialist regime there, a communist regime, and that has obviously a significant force in terms of their vote. And so the Biden campaign has really understood that to be part of why his poll numbers are lagging where Hillary Clinton was, and they're now taking steps to try to reverse that. Some of their advertising, for instance, talks about how comparing Trump to other dictatorships, talking about the attack of the rule of law, trying to compare the situation here to what they fled in terms of oppressive regimes in Central America, in the Caribbean as well. They're also having bus tours coming up very soon with members of the Hispanic caucus, hopefully some celebrity guests that they say might join as well, to talk about the same kind of message. And you've heard from Biden himself. He has tried to actually, even as he's moved left on some policy issues, say, do I look like a socialist? So that's really an important part of their message, and that's what they're trying to do to counteract that, Allison.
Hey, NBC News viewers, thanks for checking out our YouTube channel. Subscribe by clicking on that button down here, and click on any of the videos over here to watch the latest interviews, show highlights, and digital exclusives. Thanks for watching.